science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is William Prakash and you are yet once again listening to Architecture Talk. It's January 2022 and I'm excited today to be bringing to you the first part of a two-part conversation that I have had with the well-known architectural historian and theorist William J.R. Curtis. Most of you probably know William J.R. Curtis from his books, in particular Modern Architecture since 1900, Le Corbusier Ideas and Form, and his book on Vivideoshi, and along with the innumerable articles that William Curtis writes all the time. But what I'm talking to with him today in these two conversations is his take and reading on the narrative of Indian modernism. In the first conversation today, we are going to be talking about Indian modernism, but specifically in the context of the life and work of my father, Aditya Prakash. Next time, I will release a conversation with him on his thinking about the Pritzker Prize winning Indian architect B.V. Doshi. But for today's conversation, while some of William's ideas on the nature and production of modernism may be familiar to some of you, what might not be so familiar is his personal engagement with Indian modernism and the time that he has spent in India, in the South Asian subcontinent. Through that conversation, you will also see that he had a personal connection with my father, and indeed, William and I met for the first time in 1980 when he came to our house looking for material on Chandigarh. In this podcast, or perhaps it's in the next, I became an architectural historian in many ways because of William Curtis, and that is a debt that I will never be able to repay. So this conversation has a personal flavor, and I hope you enjoy it. Here we go.
So Vikram, this is an extremely touching situation. We have known one another for around 40 years. I'm not sure if I met you the first time in 1980, but we certainly met in 1983.
For sure.
And I remember you very well as a youth standing a little bit back while your father and myself and your mother, particularly your father and I, discussed architectural issues.
Yeah.
All sorts of issues. And then you would sort of disappear and come back. And then you sent me this absolutely delightful letter, which I have here. Here it is. Foundation of the Students' Discussion Circle, Chandigarh College of Art. Dear Professor Curtis, it seems like yesterday, etc., etc. We really would like to get together with you, and so on and so on. So we did, and it was absolutely memorable because we used to meet right in the middle of the capital on the memorial, the
Martyrs.
Martyrs Memorial, with a sort of open air forum with these masterpieces at each side. Sometimes with the sun going down and the moon coming up. It gave the classroom a sort of cosmic dimension, which has never been equaled in my experience. But it rests in my mind with great affection. And what are your memories of these meetings?
Well, what I remember is my dad bringing you home one day and introducing you as an architectural historian and a writer. And I was just absolutely fascinated by what you were doing. And that's the first time I thought, wow, this would be such an exciting thing to be doing as a profession, to be just writing about architecture and thinking about it. So I gotta figure out how to think about this. And so we found this group of friends. I persuaded them that we have to make this discussion circle, and we had to have our patron saint, William Curtis.
Well, I was happy to fulfill the role because I could sense this great enthusiasm and thirst for knowledge and questioning and so forth. Perhaps at this point, I should mention that my first contact with Chandigarh was 3 years earlier. And this gets us immediately to Aditya. Because in fact, one of the things I've so enjoyed about reading your book is bringing back memories of things he discussed with me very, very early on. You see, I came to India in May of 1980, on my way back from Australia, given lectures there. And in fact, rigged it in such a way that I could stop in India. I was fascinated by India. Arrived in Delhi in the hot season, got installed in a little Asian guest house off Connaught Circus. Very early in the morning, located a rickshaw driver who became my faithful guide for the next 3 days. And within an hour, was looking at the tomb of Humayun.
Fabulous.
And was completely carried away. Of course, I'd studied a lot of these things in books, but to see that in early morning light. And so it continued with zigging and zagging across the 9 Delhis, or the 7, or however many you think there are. Tughlaqabad in the extreme heat, the Kutub Minar, the Lodi tombs. I was absolutely captivated. I have to say that I had a long time been interested in Islamic architecture and, traveled a great deal in the Middle East, and India was a sort of missing link in my thinking. Then I went off to Agra, of course. I accompanied a tourist bus and then escaped from the group and from the Taj and went to the tomb of Itmud Dawla and all the rest. It was extremely hot. And then I wanted to get out to Fatehpur Sikri, and there was no sign of any taxi, but I saw a guy fixing his car in the driveway. And I said, how do you feel about driving me to Fatehpur Sikri for 100 rupees? He said, fine. So off we went and arrived in a dust storm. I remember seeing the Gate of Victory rising out of the dust. And it's a bit like the last years of Marimbad, the strange atmosphere of these haunting perspectives with nobody there, on top of the Panch Mahal with my hat blowing and scuttering across the roof and a pale sun rising up. And in the end, I spent the night in the Dak bungalow and got up very early, was completely and totally astounded by Fatehpur Sikri, of course. And then back to Delhi, and then the final leg was to take the bus from the North bus station up to Chandigarh. And I was sitting next to a chap who was in the publishing industry, and he said, my dream is to come and live in Chandigarh. I said, why is that? He said, because it's clean and green. I thought, it's a lovely place to bring people up. And, we got there to the clamor of the bus station. He said, well, where are you spending the night, Mr. William? I said, I haven't got a clue. He said, well, come with me, meet Mr. Bhatt in the Pankaj Hotel, and we'll set you up. And so I had a room in the same hotel. I was sent out with a chit to the English Wine and Beer to bring back beer. And we sat on the floor of his room. And meanwhile, I telephoned the one person who I had a formal name for, a certain Aditya Prakash, principal of the School of Architecture. This was a letter of introduction from Peter Johnson, who was the head of the school in New South Wales, in Sydney. And obviously they'd met through the Commonwealth link. A delightful letter of introduction saying, Aditya, I'd like you to meet, blah, 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 anything you can do. He's a fascinating person, blah, blah, blah. And apparently he even included a CV, which was rather formal. So your father answered, said, oh, yes, I got Johnson's letter. So why don't you come and have a cup of tea tomorrow at 9 at the School of Architecture? So, of course, I got up at 7. I was so excited. We set out in a rickshaw along Central V, where there was nobody. There was actually very little traffic in those days. And there, looming out of the greenery, were the funnels and the pyramid of the Parliament building, and I was completely blown away by the power of this form. So we met, and we immediately hit it off. It was really tremendous. And we chatted about this, and I said, look, let's just get you sorted out with a chit. I've got a letter here, formal letter to the head of the assembly of such and such. Please permit William Curtis to visit all parts of the capital, including the 2 chambers. And he said, so off you go and come to sector, to the official bungalow of the director this evening at, whenever you like, 6:30. So I set off and actually managed to go all over all the buildings, top, bottom, inside out, to photograph them. And it was, again, I mean, within 3 days of Fatehpur Sikri, I did sense the links, by the way.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the day, I went out to the yacht club and dunked my head in the water and drank about 3 bottles of water. Came across town to your parents' place with the parched lawn, and we sat outside and had whiskies and sodas. And we got again on so well. And in fact, your father started talking about his time in Britain, some of the things that you recount very, very well in your book. And then at a certain point, he said, my God, Curtis, you're so much more fun than I thought you'd be from that letter. I told my wife, oh God, there's one of these sort of American academics. He teaches at Harvard. This is going to be hard work. And actually, we have to admit something to you. I said, well, what's that? He said, well, there was a lizard that got stuck in the air conditioner. And we used your CV to scrape it off.
I remember that story. Yes.
Anyway, this established the terms of a wonderful friendship that continued in correspondence, in sending me books and text. I got all of his main publications. So this was 1980, right? So our meeting, which was 3 years later, between the two, I'd gone back. I was still teaching 2 more years at Harvard, but of course, the question was translating some of these powerful impressions into lectures and texts. I'd already thought a great deal about Corbusier. I'm sure you know. I was teaching in the Carpenter Center. I'd written a book about it. I was deeply involved with Corbusier. So, it was formulating sort of what on earth the whole thing was about. And in 1981, I did this exhibition in the Carpenter Center called Fragments of Invention on the sketchbooks of Corbusier, which included the Indian sketchbooks and, of course, the whole theme of transformation into the forms of his architecture. Metamorphosis is one of the obsessions I had.
Right.
So, this is the way things tend to work with me. Very strong direct impressions, text, and then text, back to the thing, back and forth, back and forth. So that's just to sketch it all in for the listeners.
Fantastic. Yes, I remember exactly all these things, these stories about the lizards and the seaweed. But you did get to know him quite well then, my father. How does that memory compare with the book?
Well, you see, I knew a slice, you could say. I knew certain facets of your father, and the things that came across were his values. To say a lot of the things you do talk about, but his humanism, if you wish to call it that, his animalism.
Right, animalism for sure. Yeah.
That was there very early on in the conversation, and I was intrigued, coming from a place like the USA, the extent to which he was, let's say, involved in understanding rural wisdom as a part of the equation. I'd certainly been thinking about these sort of things in relation to North Africa and other things that I had done. His wit, his sense of self-mockery, gentle. But when he told me the stories about pumping shillings into gas meters in freezing cold Edinburgh, wherever he was, these were the stories that settled. He did not talk about the Franconia. One of the things I love in your book is the voyage of discovery.
Yeah.
It's very well done. The early part of the book is, I really, enjoy this very much. And then, of course, having to deal with British society, having to deal with dinner jackets or goodness knows what, having to deal with the oddities and formalities of British society. But the other thing that struck me very strongly, again, you see, I was, let's say, on the edge of Harvard. I was not teaching full time in the graduate school of design. On the contrary, I used my position in Carpenter Center as a kind of commando post, because there was so much nonsense going on there, in the form of a nascent postmodernism, simple-minded typology, all the things that were banging in schools. And, so and of course, a very deep skepticism about any concept of planning in any real sense. This was regression into the idea that there is no such thing as an intelligent plan, collage city, you sort of bounce off the existing, contextuals and this and that. So to come to the great Chandigarh and to meet someone who was absolutely clear about the importance of a grand plan for society, of integrating the modern and nature. He was not an unquestioning Corbusian on the urbanistic plan.
No,
not at all, as we know. But this was extremely interesting to me to contrast the kind of things I've been surrounded in constantly in the Harvard environment with what I was seeing in front of myself, with my own eyes, and with the writings, which were full of faith, let's say, in what a place like Chandigarh could do for humanity. And I thought this was wonderful, and they were like kind of really odd objects in that kind of cynical, world that I was surrounded by.
Right. No, I like your use of the word faith. I mean, he continued to have faith in this sense in the modernist ethos and the modernist plan, even as he was very critical of a lot of aspects of it, and there was discussion about how to move the discourse ahead, but was very unhappy about the turn to the postmodernism, not only at the GSD, but in many aspects of Indian architecture as well, right? Did you encounter some of that? I know you got beyond Chandigarh, you got quite involved in Indian modernism at many different registers. Did you?
I got involved in Indian modernism, but I got involved in Indian traditions. Let me explain that the second trip, when I came with Catherine, we were actually, we sort of cut all the strings with the West and just pushed off. And we'd set up a base in Bangkok. And from there, we explored Southeast Asia. I just had a deep feeling, starting in the late 70s, that I could give a marvelous lecture about the Pantheon or about Palladio, about this or that, but that I was deeply ignorant of the great moments of Asian architecture and of their systems of meaning, and that there was a lot of inspiration to be had. So actually, after that, the great revelation at Fatehpur Sikri with the sun rising out of the dust, and after Chandigarh, I said to my about-to-be wife, I said, look, how do you feel about really just pushing off? And she said, wonderful. She had been, she's from a diplomat's family. She'd been brought up partly in Southeast Asia. So actually in 83, before we turned up the second time in Chandigarh, we had been on the road for about 2 months in pretty rigorous conditions, plunging into the depths of Indian traditional architecture. I mean, places like Aihole, Patadakal, the beginnings of the Hindu temple. I was trying to understand the archetypes, Buddhist archetypes, because in Thailand you have much later rendition of these forms. And so we went to, the great sites. We lost ourselves in provincial towns, day-to-day life. We were wandering. We stumbled into Ahmedabad, about 3/4 of the way through this thing. Yeah. So Ahmedabad was a colossal impact, of course, for the modern as well, to see Corbusier's 4 buildings there. Right. And then we came finally again to finish up to Chandigarh. So when I came to Chandigarh and met your group, there was quite a lot of, let's say, ancient India under the belt, including in sketchbooks, photos, and so forth. It was a deep immersion, I would say. And I always felt about Corbusier, and there's nothing so original about saying this, that he was a great modernist, but of course he had a profound sense of the past. Right. And I published a piece in Prospector 20, the Yale Journal, which used to be a really excellent journal. I don't know how it is now, which was called Authenticity, Abstraction, and the Ancient Sense, Le Corbusier's and Louis Kahn's Ideas of Parliament. Mm-hmm. And you can pick up the edge there, because this was an attack on postmodernism. It was saying the profound modernists, have a much deeper sense of the past than the people throwing around keystones or whatever. Yeah. So there was a line of thinking there. And in my last year or so at Harvard, they had a really actually extremely good conference called Monument and City, where I did a whole thing about, the great modern monumental builders, whether it was the Sydney Opera House, or of course Khan. I was getting profoundly interested in Khan, although I hadn't yet been to see Bangladesh. I'd been in Ahmedabad, which was strong enough. But I realized there again that, this was an architect with a radar that picked up very deep messages from the past and metabolized them into his architecture. So the Indian experiences were, in a curious way, involved with both the modern and the ancient. And when coming, now to the Festival of India, you see, so here I was in and out of these things. And out of the blue, I received a telegram in Bangkok from the Aga Khan Award for Architecture at the end of '84, saying, would you be available in Geneva to come as a special guest of the steering committee to discuss whatever? I thought, well, okay. I mean, I knew about their activities. I was always a little bit cautious about some of their activities, the Islamic identity, etc. Mm-hmm. But so we went, and it was, of course, staying at the Hotel Richemont, the Mercedes driving you around, and all the other accoutrements of the Aga Khan. And among the people on the committee were people I knew very well, like Oleg Grabar, Bill Porter but I met for the first time Charles Correa. Mm-hmm. Charles and I hit it off. We were sitting at breakfast one day, and we started talking about India. I said, oh, yes, well, at Tanjore, the such and such. And, oh, yes, I mean, just came out with a string of these things in Sri Lanka and this. And I said, my God, you've been around. I said, well, look, this is a passion for me, Charles. I mean, I'm, deeply, deeply interested in the architectures of the subcontinent. Yeah? Mm. Well, he said, this is perfect. I said, what do you mean it's perfect? He said, I'm going to contact the Festival of India immediately in India, have you flown out to join up a committee with Papal Jaika and company. And I would like you to be involved in the selection of modern works in this thing, although you obviously have a very deep feeling for the past. So, we were off in Mexico, actually. I was giving a stack of lectures there, and then telegram, go and pick up your first class tickets and your visa. So instead of being on bull carts and staying in dak bungalows, suddenly we were at 6-star hotels with drivers and all the rest of it. It was really funny. And so the great day came of Safdarjung Road to meet Jaika, who was, as you know, Mrs. Gandhi's sort of right-hand person in so many things. Right. Kapilya Vatsyayan, who was the kind of philosopher, and other notables, And so I was sort of drawn into this sort of Delhi, high-flowing society, and indeed began to prospect for interesting modern work. I mean, using the driver, well-known things, of course, Raj Rawal and so on and so on. But others, and the same in Chandigarh and the same in the surroundings of Ahmedabad. This was the beginning of a thing that never fully worked out, as I'll come to in a moment. Now, Charles, as you know, it was actually called Darshan at the beginning. It was not called Vistara, this thing. And he was obsessed with the mandala, or at least with 9 squares.
Right.
And we had very intense discussions. And I said, well, wait a minute, Charles. I mean, a mandala is not just a shape.
Yeah.
Point 1. 2, I think there's an ideological risk in this. He said, what do you mean, an ideological risk? I said, there's an ideological risk imposing the idea that anything of real interest in India stems automatically from that tradition. I said, that can be easily turned on its head. And in fact, there's a school of historians, Nat, who used to say under every tomb, there's basically a temple form. Well, we know where this all went eventually, don't we?
Yes, that's right. We do. Yeah.
I blew the whistle on that before it happened. I said, I'm just not comfortable with this, this idea of tracing everything back to. Anyway, we had a sort of bit of a thing about this. Anyway, all this to say, well, then in parallel, I had met Raj Rawal, who was organizing the French Festival of India,
right,
which was much more neutral in its way of treating the past, with excellent redone drawings, improving on the Government of India drawings and so on, and with 3 sections: the past, Corbusier and company, and then the contemporary. And I wrote a piece on actually called The Ancient in the Modern, about the capital. So indeed, there were all these confluences. But and then a lot of other texts followed fairly quickly. I mean, I think that Towards an Authentic Regionalism is one of them. And That was delivered in Bangladesh, in a great event in '85. And once again, in that audience, I said, well, do you see Khan's building as a thing off another planet that's just been plonked here from, quote unquote, the West? Or do you see it as something which actually has the capacity to generate interconnections with lost past? Because I see it as that. I see it related to a centralized tradition. I see it as an incredible transformation of tomb forms, a deep, deep understanding of these. Anyway, led to these kind of debates. So in the piece which I read out there, I actually wanted to say, that's why I'm sort of cautious about heaving around the word postmodern, because I think that the depth of understanding of tradition of a Rewal or a Doshi or whatever is not to be confused with the kind of lightweight stuff that was going on in Europe. They were interested in tradition in the late 50s and reading it. But of course, that was a position very different from your father's, which you bring out very clearly in the book.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, what do you think was the impact of the festivals on the discourse of Indian architecture at that time? Did it move it in the right direction? How do you think it helped, or how did it play out? Just from your impression, how did the festivals play out in their mission?
In which place? In
either one, the US or the Paris one, and you can differentiate, or the Russian one even.
Well, it's hard for me to say what
just the architectural part, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that, in France, which is after all a fairly sophisticated audience, there was a full understanding of what was being said, that what I wrote about Corbusier was very well received there. I remember this. And there was the Riboulet, who did a beautiful thing about the composition of the capital, the geometry and so on. Jean-Louis Verret was the commissioner of that, who had worked just with Corbusier in Ahmedabad. For the traditional architecture, it was just, a very fine presentation of buildings that interested French people. I don't think they kind of took it in any ideological sense at all. And then there was curiosity about the contemporary architectural culture, including Tagore Theatre, by the way, which was included in both festivals.
Right. Both. Which, has been kind of destroyed now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Go on.
So of course, I do know that.
Yeah.
Now, I think it's like all oversimple messages. They have to be issued with a government smoking warning, and this issue of the past with a big P was at real risk of running amok in India. I think you see, Adoshi or Korea or whatever, they were deeply grounded in modern architectural planning principles and abstraction and so forth and so on. So when they were interacting with the past, it was with strong filters that were, in fact, extending the modern tradition in one way or another. Just as true of Giancarlo De Carlo or any number of other people. And of course, they were very aware of Team 10. They were very aware of those rereadings of the urban fabric and so forth that the Smithsons were involved in, which helped them to look at the urban tissue in a certain way in India. So there was a kind of strength. The more that architects loosen their relationship, the tension with Corbusier was very, very important. I mean, for example, one of my favorite buildings by Korea is the Bharat Bhavan in
Bhopal.
In Bhopal, the marvelous building.
Fabulous building, fabulous, yeah.
Now, look, this is a beautifully sited series of platforms and courts. It's an incredibly clever transformation of the platforms of the Sydney Opera House, combined with, of course, a Corbusian capping and so on and so on. But, with great wit and skill and elegance, it produces this kind of a building that resonates with the mosques across the lake and on. You can go on forever about that building. So I think that as long as there was this sort of tension with the quote unquote modern masters, the past was something enriching. If you cut the strings, you were left with pastiche. you were left without, with just sort of reiterations of images of the past. That was the danger in the whole thing. But I wouldn't overrate the importance of the festivals of India, actually.
And you've been to Jaipur, and did you see the Jawahar Kala Kendra and the other later Korea buildings, even the British Council in Delhi?
Well, yes, you could say that in Charles's own production, he became too literal. I mean, he used in these Aga Khan meetings, which I was quite frequently invited for these things around the place. He used to make the distinction between transfer and transformation. Mm-hmm. He said transfer is just taking the outer shapes of meaning, if you like, without the meaning, and applying them. Whereas transformation is digging in, understanding what's going on, and injecting a new level of meaning. Mm-hmm. And he tried to double code, if you want to use that word, in the other Bhopal building, the State Assembly.
Right.
With the round plan. And there I just think he goes too far. I think the quotations are too obvious. If you like, yeah.
There isn't enough transformation. But why do you think that happened? I mean, Charles Correa, unbelievably bright man. I mean, sophisticated, articulate thinker, and doing such an amazing body of work, starting from the late 70s onward. Suddenly, just from then, somewhere there onwards, became much more, whatever the word is, literal in his transformations.
Well, I don't know if it's the pressure of international fashion. I mean, I have to say, in parallel with these my involvements with India, I was highly critical of some of the choices of the Aga Khan Award. I mean, in 1985, they selected, 86 rather, the Bong Mosque in Pakistan, which was this complete.
And
the jury
Robert Wentry was the jury.
Yes, of course. You see, it was Abdel Wakil. It was instant history for the Gulf. It was marketing. Abdel Wakil posed as the spiritual son of Fatih, but did these Fatih-esque buildings for millionaires in Jeddah and so on and so forth. So there was a pressure towards an oversimplistic traditionalism, obviously, in some of those societies. And there was a kind of unholy marriage between postmodernism and that kind of traditionalism, I would say. And I know they never acknowledged, for example, the amazing skyscraper in Jeddah by Gordon Bunshaft, which is the oases in the air. It was just unthinkable for them to do that. So, there were pressures of all kinds. So we're really talking about the mid 80s and the kind of flux of architectural opinion around the world. And I think that Doshi's best work is still when he's in high tension with Corbusier and Khan. I mean, Sangat is the even earlier works I like very much,
Yeah, I mean, Sangat is just brilliant. I mean, I think it was a fantastic building. What do you think? Well, we'll do Doshi later on. Yeah. Tell me, you had this whole concept of Akbar's camp for the festivals, installation idea for the festival.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Yeah. Well, now this was a whole story, which is a little bit touchy. You have to be careful here.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, you see, Charles was a person of the most tremendous gusto, to make things happen. He kept arranging for me to be flown in and out. We'd meet up in Bombay, and meet here, and meet there, and we were coming to the question of the installation. And I said, look, you've got a theme of meandering, but also of cuts going right through, linking, foreground and background, linking certain, let's say, core ideas in tradition that are transformed. And this begins to suggest a geometry. And I did a sketch, which I called Akbar's Camp, which was with, temporary wooden pieces and then these see-throughs and this zigzagging thing. Anyway, what came out was a little bit like Akbar's Camp. But by then I was no longer involved with the whole thing because Charles sent me off on a wild goose chase in America to go and talk to the director of the New York Public Library about possibly putting the show there when I was teaching in the States. And they didn't have a brief on it. I was put in a very strange position. So, things kind of went off in their different direction. And in the end, it never appeared in the USA. It went to, an exhibition space in Bombay and was given this new title, Vistara, and which was very much his agenda. of the, the 9 Square Plan and so forth. The best thing in that catalogue, from my point of view, is the interview with the wonderful architect in the South.
Laurie Baker.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, wonderful interview. So you see, you know better than I, there were a lot of things brewing in India about tradition and identity and this and that, which, people were responding to in their different manner.
So what has been your engagement with India since the 90s or in the 2000s? I know you were involved in the Chandigarh conference and in between and so on. So how have you sort of continued this engagement?
In 88, after really 8 years of a very intense presence in and out, in which I wrote, some of the things that the introduction to the Raj Rewal monograph in French, Architecture moderne, Racines indiennes, modern architecture, Indian roots. Lots of articles in various formats. And of course, the Architectural Review, Modern Architecture and the Search for Indian Identity, 1987. And remember that, these are just articles. What was really going on, one of the reasons I needed to go to Chandigarh was that I was writing Le Corbusier, Ideas and Forms, and which was written in 85, 86 with 2, very substantial chapters on India, one on Chandigarh, and the other on Ahmedabad. And so, similarly, going back to 1980, the impact of that first visit was very clear in the text, Modern Architecture since 1900. These were the hefties. In 87, I did a second edition of Modern Architecture since 1900, which was written on the table at the back of Sangat, by the way, which included a selection of works by Charles, by Doshi, of course, the Sangat, by Anant Rajay, and so forth and so on. So this period was one of maximum contact with very many different things going on in India. So after 88, I didn't go back until 99. I sort of needed to get away anyway. I was being kind of drawn into a stepwell, of Indianness. And so, I got involved in other things, got very involved in Spanish architecture, actually, when it came to...
Miralles, yeah, you were working on
Yes.
I love that. Yeah, amazing work, yeah.
Yeah, well, the very first collaboration I did with El Croquis was on Miralles and Pinos, and it's one of my favorite essays too. It's called Mental Maps and Social Landscapes. And
yes. I know it well, yeah.
I did maybe 15 texts over 10 years, with it's a lot involved in that, with Caesar, with this and that. Yeah. So for a period at least, my life was much more European, a little bit less USA. I was very rarely teaching or doing anything in the USA. We were living in France, where we do live. And India was always, in the back of my mind, and there were communications. And then this invitation came to the 50 years of the IDEA Congress in 99, which your father, quite extraordinarily, was not made part of, which I just find astounding. But anyway, I'm sure you do too. So, and I was given center stage there, and a keynote, and not the keynote, that was the one with Kenneth Frampton. But it was wonderful to come back and meet people again and so forth. Although I always felt, that they're just passing through. I know this place. I really have a very deep emotional link to. Yeah. And let us not forget, we need to do some backtracking, because in 83 was when I first met P.L. Varma.
Yes. Yeah.
And we became profound friends. I have wonderful letters. I have one here where he's talking about the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi and what it meant to him and so on. So, so there was this big event in 99. And for me, part of the beauty of that was that Dennis Lasdon and his wife could come. And, the architect of all architects to understand monumentality, the National Theatre, who'd studied Chandigarh since he was, since the first drawings appeared, to see his face light up when he walked up the ramps of the High Court, it was fantastic, And then we traveled around together, went to Ranakpur, went to Ahmedabad, and so on and so forth. So this was a month back in India, but it was not the same as the kind of engagement that there had been earlier on. And then we can kind of track fast forward to 2015, when they had all the celebrations to do with the cleanup and the UNESCO, etc. And there I had the honor of presenting my big second edition of Corbusier to the governor of Punjab, and this and that and the other. That was a real, back where we used to meet. And there was a fancy dinner at the Swiss embassy in Delhi. And I was moving around from one place to another, and suddenly this elegant gentleman sat next to me and said, "I'm Bajpai. I was the ambassador at Safdarjung Road when you came, and we all met." And I said, "Oh my." And then along comes your friend, isn't it, Lal, who did the book?
Yeah.
Yes, he said, "Well, I don't know if you remember me, but I was one of the boys on the ramps." Oh my God. He presented me with this huge tome on Buddhist architecture. So India sort of comes and goes, and as does Bangladesh, by the way. It's just a kind of thing that keeps moving in and out. There was, I always felt that CEPT was like a spiritual home, the school in Ahmedabad, especially the kind of the T zone at the back, bumping into people. And one of my memories of this, being there, and there was this 361 degrees thing. There was the Vaki Memorial lectures and what have you at CEPT. This is 2014. I can't remember, but it was when Charles gave his last lecture in Ahmedabad. It was a very impressive event, and that's when I realized the extreme danger into which the modern patrimony of India was falling. There were members of the administration of the city and so on. I stood up and I said, "I've known Ahmedabad for 30-something years. I've known it when it was a dusty, semi-rural environment, and of course it's in a boom of some kind, but there are a lot of things at risk in this model of development." And I, set off on a harangue about what it was doing to the city and quality. And I said, not least is your cultural memory. And when I say cultural memory, I say I invite you to get into a taxi and go out to Sarkej and look at the deterioration of these great Muslim monuments. I think it's important to underline that they're Muslim monuments. There was a hierarchy operating, clearly. And I said, and not just that, your modern buildings are under threat. And he looked at me as if the journalists all leapt forward, to take notes and all the rest of it. And Charles skedaddled off and so on. Anyway, then at a dinner in the dark, we were together again, and this all came up. And that's when I started to write pieces in the Architectural Review about the importance of redefining the patrimony laws to protect the best of modern architecture. And then what happened, a year ago with Khan and all that, and I got very involved in the forefront of that battle to try and save Khan's dormitories, and I don't know where that is now. But there we are. We've brought this a long way up to date, but they are in retrospect engagements with India. It's not the same immediate passion there was between 80 and 88, which was a particular stage in one's life, a particular stage in India, but a very very, very deep one. And the impact of the ancient things has remained with me. I've done photographic exhibitions. I'm also a painter, by the way, which is one of the things.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh,
yes. Well, there we go. You see, and my paintings, which are called mental landscapes, are abstractions of the world and of nature, but also they come out of my travel sketches of ruins and what have you. So this is something we can get back to when we come back to Aditya, because this aspect of his life was very, very important.
The painting was very important for my father, of course. Was he painting in his office even when you visited him still?
Not that I can remember. I actually don't even remember talking to him about that, but it's obvious, from your book how important that was in the last years of his life, and the continuous line. And incidentally, your announcement. Students' discussion circle has a continuous line. We've sketched there a kind of parabola, over 40 years of various things about Indian architecture. And supposing we now go back to your father and his work and and eventually your book, because he, one of the things that I like very much about the book is it's a hugely important documentation of how things were really being done in the team of people in Chandigarh, how the whole thing was put together, the roles of different people, the relationship with Pierre Jeanneret, and so forth. And you could say the sort of professional expectations that were built in for this generation of Indian architects. I think that the other thing is the architectural language, because, my obsessions with Chandigarh are with the monumental. You ask about me coming back to India. I forgot to mention the number of times I've written other texts about Chandigarh. The sense of dealing with very great architecture is something that doesn't leave me. I keep coming around to the symbolic power of those buildings in numerous texts in one form or another, going all the way back through the 90s. I've always concentrated more on that than on the rest of the place, which is not because I'm not interested in it. It's just, you do what you do.
Right.
I think that one of the things that intrigued me when I first came was the language of the rest of the fabric. I mean, to say, the rows of shops, the different categories of housing, and sort of where does that all fit in? And obviously it's got a lot to do with Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew, but not just. So this question of a sort of more normative typology and language is extremely important, to understand the fabric of Chandigarh. And I remember when I was there in 1999, I was sitting next to Bernard Huet, a French architect, who said, I'm much more interested in the schools and the hospitals than I am in Corbusier's great monuments. I'm interested in a relative neutrality. And I think there's almost an unplotted hierarchy system of architectural language, which reminds me of Alberti's ideas on the city, that the monuments have, grandiose treatment, and then you work your way down, to pilasters, and then eventually to openings, and so on and so on and so on. And this goes through the frame. You talk about the
frame control, yeah.
Those frame controls are on, full stop diapason operatic grandiosity with the Corbusier buildings, and then down to relative neutrality in the other buildings. So your father's architecture was, for the most part, in that zone. I think that you convey very clearly his priorities as a designer and as an architect in the book.
That's great. Were there unexpected things in the book, things that surprised you?
Well, I didn't know really about the agricultural colleges. I'd never studied those, and these were fascinating. So that was, completely new to me. And of course, a lot of his own photographs, which are absolutely fantastic. He's a very good photographer. His linear cities, I didn't know about either. You see, I think that there can be a kind of time lag with concepts. I mean, probably a lot of people thought he was just nuts with these ideas at the time.
Oh, they did, totally, at that time, yeah.
But actually, I think a linear formulation of urban growth is absolutely pertinent to India, because that's what's happening automatically in laissez-faire development along roads. So the idea of a sort of more tidied up version of that is certainly pertinent today. What comes through is a willingness to reflect on the future, to try and have a more balanced. He says at one point, I don't believe in the distinction between country and city. They should completely interconnected at all points, and they are, in fact, often things of this kind.
I put a lot of emphasis on the Nehruvian impression on the city and what I call Nehruvian modernism, the idea that there was a certain ethos. It was, that in a certain way, Corbusier and the whole Chandigarh ethos, found a perfect match in the Nehruvian moment. I thought that it's like a two-way kind of a meeting of minds. What do you think about the discussion of the concept of Nehruvian modernism?
I thought it was a bit too schematic. I mean, I think that this needs to be investigated more for the complexities of the situation. I mean, Nehru himself, it's a sort of odd mixture of third world socialism, technocracy, modernize or perish. Well, and you could say Corbusier himself, his ethos is also a kind of odd mixture of different ideological strands. Did they overlap at some points? Probably they did. Temple of the New India and all of that. I think there's a little bit of a danger in using the term Nehruvian to apply to an aesthetic in architecture. The architecture existed anywhere, with or without, it comes along, it so happens at the behest of Nehru and his politics, but to kind of join the two terms too tightly together is a little bit at risk, I would say. Nehruvian modernism, especially since there are a whole lot of other modernisms operating in India at the same time. The kind of language which your father was involved in was very prevalent in Chandigarh, but I mean, there's a Joseph Allen Stein, there's a Doshi.
Sure.
It's quite a complex, I would say, eclectic panorama, eclectic archipelago Indian architecture in the 50s and 60s. Right. Different strands of thought, Kamvinde, different readings of Corbusier, going this way, going that way. So I'm just a little bit cautious about it as a terminology.
Right. Did you meet people like Kamvinde and Stein and this other modernists of the time in Delhi?
They were friends. We used to have tea together, No, I mean, I was very privileged because I just hit it off with these characters. I remember Kamvinde with his splendid hat, his sort of Afghan hat. And of course, he was from a slightly different lineage via GSD, sort of Gropius background. Not that accounts for very much in the end. I think people over-condition these discussions about people's schooling. But I admired some of his dairy buildings, these buildings with these great industrial towers. He had a particular ethos. Joseph Allen Stein, I also knew pretty well, who was the most philosophically minded person, quite extraordinary. I mean, again, see, he was actually basically an American socialist, if not a communist, who got out and came, I think in the MacArthur period. His background was very complicated, the way he eventually...
Yeah, he got out during McCarthy, that's for sure, yeah.
Yeah, and then he found his way in Bengal and eventually back to Delhi, but his softened modernism of the International Center, for example, the way he placed that with the Lodi tombs, was very well done. It didn't carry me away in the way that some buildings can, but I appreciated the slight organicism in his way of looking at the world too. He told wonderful stories. I was with him having had tea actually in a grand setting, which was the American Embassy residence. And we stepped out into the long alleyway of Chanakapuri there. And there were a couple of very poor ladies with sticks trying to beat down branches off the trees. And then here were all these corps diplomatique cars going by, ignoring them completely. Everybody was ignoring these ladies as they were trying to get this wood. Stein said, "You know what Dostoevsky said about trees, William?" I said, "No." He said, "For the rich, they're beauty. For the poor, they're fuel."
Right.
And this would lead to a whole discussion about the great unknown masses of India. I was totally aware in all of these wanderings in India that I was just in a tiny kind of sector of the reality of the place. I mean, I was in largely urban India, rather sophisticated English-speaking, or was in Ahmedabad, which I love very much. But, apart from our kind of deep travels into, land profonde, I was aware of this vast unknown continent, really, which was the rest of India. But the travels were, they're still with me. I mean, to say the way the way we did things in that those first wanderings of '83. I mean, like taking the mail as far as Sholapur, the train that was on the way to Madras from Bombay, changing onto a single gauge railway, going to a place like Bijapur.
Beautiful. Oh, of course. Gorgeous architecture.
Wonderful, absolutely. And, losing yourself in this provincial town for a week when there were riots going on and God knows what was going on, and living with a curfew. But at the same time, you're sitting there and there's a power cut, and someone approaches your table and says, "Good evening, I'm the chief police of Bijapur." And you think, "Oh God, he wants to see the papers," or say, "You don't have any used razor blades, do you?" That's India 1983.
Wow.
Yes. Now, I was carrying, a Pentax Spotmatic, about 12 reels of film. We were very disciplined. We had just whatever you could carry with you. That was the rule of the game. And we were pretty fit in those days, in the way that I'm certainly not now. But anyway, and we got eventually to Badami. It's another gorgeous place. And the guest house there had not been opened for about a month. So they panicked and opened up. And then we, went off to photograph, to look at the caves and, so forth. And then this is 3 weeks into the Indian trip. The winder jammed on my camera. Jesus Christ, this is just a tragedy of the first order. We go back to the guest house and it was thronging with people. I said, "What happened?" He said, "We don't know. A bus of Belgian people arrived and we're opening the whole place up." So I went around and there was a chap sitting there and I said, "Vous parlez français?" "Oui." "Is there anybody in your group who knows about cameras?" He said, "Ah oui, there's Monsieur Dubois, who has the best camera shop in Brussels." So I gave it, he fixed my camera on the spot and the whole thing was done. But I mean, these, the kind of losing yourself in villages, sleeping in very, very primitive conditions, you got a sense at least of deepest rural India. But at the same time, the vast areas of 90 or more languages, the inner India, you didn't know, you couldn't know.
No, that takes a lot. Yeah, that would take a lot. And now when you look back, India, it's 2021. 1980 was like over 40 years ago.
Let me put it in very kind of simple-minded terms. When I was in Delhi, the first trip, I could walk down the center of an avenue, and there were just a few cattle munching grass, between the embassies. Traffic jam that's, bogged down for an hour, pollution, with all the things So, obviously one of the things one would be talking about, which is important for architecture, is neoliberalism altogether, and what kind of models were, socially speaking, important for architecture in the 80s in the state sector. And obviously, one of the building types is the educational citadel, if you want to call it that. I mean, to say university buildings, educational buildings conceived as miniature cities, like the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad to begin with, but then designed by Doshi or designed by Rajay or whatever. And those large kind of public sector places were one of the areas of tremendous architectural and social invention. Now that's all gone. I mean, it's a totally different world that the architect operates in India today. It's coming to India, the most recently, which was 5 years ago, it was a bit of a shock. I mean, to see the state of smash and grab property developing. It's one of the reasons I blew the whistle on, protecting the modern masterpieces. It's one of the problems with IIM, from this, the Gujarati model of development, so-called. I mean, if we get going on Mr. Modi, if you will. But I think that there's that, and obviously there's the whole, preoccupying erosion of secularism altogether, of the creation of sort of religious politics of a certain kind, which is troubling to me at least. But that was well underway in the 90s. I remember one of the bridges in Ahmedabad with orange flags all the way along it. And I remember hearing from Doshi about the attack on the school, by extremists. So, these are all, this is another India that's been coming about. But I could go on and on about the differences. Any thoughts you have yourself?
No, I agree with you. I feel very distant from the new India. I essentially left India in the mid-80s, somewhere there. And I feel disconcerted when I go back to India now. And thank you for this conversation. We will continue this and focus more on, in particular, on Doshi and his life and career in our next edition.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.